They say the mind is a fragile thing. Mine wasn't fragile, it was glass, and someone had taken a hammer to it long ago. All that was left were the glittering, razor-sharp shards. For how long I'd been lying there, I couldn't say. Days? Weeks? Time had dissolved into a meaningless, syrupy crawl. My body had become a statue of flesh and bone, a useless anchor in a sea of my own filth. The signals from my brain to my limbs had been cut. I was a prisoner in my own skull, and my prison was crowded. Nightmarish. They were always there, the shadow people, flickering at the edges of my vision, things made of television static and pure malice. They had no faces, no features, just the unnerving man-shaped void where a person should be. They'd lean in close, their presence a palpable cold spot in the stale air of my room, and I could feel their non-existent breath on my skin. They never touched me, but I knew they were feeding on my terror, growing stronger in the darkness of my decay. Worse than the sights, though, were the sounds. An endless, overlapping cacophony of screams filled every moment of silence. Men, women, children, all wailing in a symphony of madness that vibrated deep in my bones. It was the soundtrack to my collapse, a constant reminder that I was utterly and completely alone in my suffering. But one voice always cut through the choir of the damned. Her voice. Eleanor's. My mother's. It wasn't just screaming. It was worse. It was her words. The same one she'd branded onto my soul as a child, now echoing in the hollowed-out chambers of my mind. Useless. Worthless. A pathetic disappointment, Leo. Her voice wasn't just an echo, it was a hook, and it was dragging me back, pulling me under the surface of the present and into the murky depths of the past, back to the day the first crack appeared in the glass. I must have been 6, maybe 7. The kitchen smelled of simmering tomato sauce and simmering rage. I'd done something wrong. Spilled a glass of milk, I think. A simple, childish mistake that, in our house, was a capital crime. I remember the look on her face, the way her lips pulled back from her teeth in a smile that held no warmth, only a terrifying promise of pain. "We need to teach you a lesson, don't we, Leo?" she'd cooed, her voice a sickly sweet poison. "A lesson you won't forget." Her hand, a vice of knobby knuckles and sharp nails, clamped around my wrist. She dragged me, stumbling, toward the stove. I can still see the angry orange glow of the electric coil, pulsing with heat. I begged, I pleaded, I promised I'd be good, that I'd never spill anything ever again. My tears meant nothing to her. "This is what happens to bad little boys who don't listen," she hissed, her face close to mine. Then she forced my hand down. The world exploded into a white-hot scream of pure agony. The sound of my own skin hissing and popping against the burner, a sound like bacon frying in a hot pan. The acrid smell of burning meat, my meat, filled my nostrils. The pain was absolute, a supernova that consumed my entire being. Through it all, she just held me there, her grip like iron, her eyes glittering with a chilling satisfaction. "Maybe now," she whispered, as she finally pulled my blackened, blistering hand away, "you'll finally learn." Even now, lying paralyzed in bed, I could feel the ghost of that burn, a phantom fire crawling up my arm. That was the lesson I learned. Not to avoid spilling milk, but that pain was love, that cruelty was care, and that my own mother was the most terrifying monster in the world. She had shattered me then, and I had spent the rest of my life trying to hold the pieces together. Now finally, I had let them all fall. The shadow people danced in the corners of my vision, the nameless chorus screamed my eulogy, and Eleanor, my dear mother, whispered her final lullaby of hate into my ear. I closed my mind's eye. I was a shattered thing in a broken world, and I was finally ready for the end. The end didn't come with a whisper, as I had expected. It came with the squeal of tires on asphalt and the heavy thud of boots on the porch. From the depths of my catatonic state, the sounds were distant, filtered through a thick fog. Then, the splintering crack of my apartment door being forced open shattered the fragile quiet of my tomb. Heavy footsteps pounded on the floorboards, the vibrations traveling up the legs of my bed and into my spine. Voices, thick with a mixture of professional calm and personal disgust, cut through the air. Jesus Christ, the smell. Got a live one. Barely. Male. Late 20s. Unresponsive. Check his pupils. Hello? Can you hear me, son? I could hear them. I could see their blurry shapes moving around me, their faces pinched with pity and revulsion. But I couldn't respond. The connection was severed. I was a ghost haunting my own body, watching as they poked and prodded the useless vessel I was trapped inside. They were talking about a person, but it didn't feel like they were talking about me. I was already gone. And then I saw it. Above me, a crack appeared in the stained, water-damaged ceiling. It wasn't a fracture in the plaster, but a tear in reality itself. Through the fissure leaked a light so pure and golden, it made my soul ache. It wasn't the harsh, accusatory light of the paramedics' flashlights. This was warmth, an invitation. The screaming in my head quieted, drawn to the light like moths to a flame. The shadow people recoiled, dissolving back into the corners of the room as if scalded by its purity. Something inside me, the part that was truly me, began to rise. It was a gentle, inexorable pull. I felt myself detaching, shedding the weight of my flesh like a heavy, soiled coat. I floated upward, free from the filth, the paralysis, the pain. I passed through the tear in the ceiling and emerged into paradise. I was standing in a meadow, bathed in the perpetual glow of a late afternoon sun. Wildflowers in impossible colors carpeted rolling green hills that stretched to a horizon of soft, hazy mountains. A gentle breeze carrying the scent of honey and clean rain rustled the leaves of a lone, perfect oak tree. The silence was the most beautiful part. The screaming was gone. The constant, gnawing whisper of my mother's voice was gone. I was, for the first time in my memory, completely and utterly at peace. From my serene vantage point, the hole in my ceiling became a window looking down into the squalor I had just escaped. I watched, with a strange and clinical detachment, as the paramedics loaded my body onto a gurney. That thing on the gurney wasn't me. It was a slab of meat, a puppet whose strings had been cut. My body of meat. I felt no connection to it. No sympathy for its plight. I drifted along behind the ambulance, an invisible passenger in my own sky-bound heaven. I followed my body of meat into the sterile, white corridors of a hospital. I floated through walls and watched as doctors in crisp coats surrounded it, their faces grim. Severe paranoid schizophrenia with catatonic features, one said, flipping through a chart. Malnourished, dehydrated. Look at the necrosis around these pressure sores. It's progressing faster than it should. It's as if something is actively feeding on him. A chill, the first I'd felt in this perfect place, ran through me. They could see it. They couldn't understand it, but they could see the physical toll the shadow people had taken. My invisible tormentors left visible wounds. Days bled into one another. In my meadow, time had no meaning. I watched the doctors try to nourish my body, to coax it back to life. But in my sunlit paradise, a new and unsettling feeling began to grow. The perfection was the problem. The sun never moved. The breeze never changed. The flowers never wilted. I was the sole inhabitant of my own personal heaven, and I was discovering that heaven was just a prettier cage. The profound peace I had first felt was slowly souring into a profound loneliness. The silence, once a balm, was becoming a deafening roar. I was safe, but I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. My idyllic prison, my lonely paradise, was not meant to last. From my sunlit meadow, I heard the doctor's verdict echo up from the world below. Their words were hollow, distant things, but their meaning was a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of my peace. Aggressive approach, electroconvulsive therapy, a hard reset. I felt a hook sink into my soul. It was a violent metaphysical tether that snagged my consciousness and began to drag me from my heaven. The golden hills warped and twisted. The perfect sky tore open, not with light, but with a blinding, agonizing whiteness. I was being reeled in, pulled from my blissful detachment and dragged back toward the prison of my own flesh. The landing was not a gentle return. It was a full-body impact, a head-on collision with reality. Pain, blistering, all-consuming pain. It was as if lightning had been poured directly into my veins. Every nerve ending screamed, sizzling and popping with a phantom current. My back arched violently off a hard, cold surface, my muscles locked in a brutal, spasming dance. The taste of burnt metal and blood flooded my mouth, and a hoarse, ragged scream ripped itself from my throat, the first sound I had made in what felt like a lifetime. When the violent convulsions finally subsided into a full-body tremor, I forced my heavy eyelids open. The world swam into focus, blurry and foreign. This wasn't the sterile white hospital room I had left. This was a cage. I was in a small, square room made of bare concrete, the walls weeping dark, ambiguous stains. The air was frigid and thick with the smell of decay, poorly masked by the sharp chemical bite of antiseptic. A single, naked light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a weak, jaundiced glow over everything. High on one wall was a narrow slit of a window, not for light or air, but to remind its occupant of their confinement, its view obstructed by thick, rusted iron bars. A wave of pure, undiluted terror washed over me, cold and sharp. This wasn't a recovery room, this was a cell. My limbs felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and unresponsive, but a desperate survival instinct took over. I pushed myself up, my whole body shaking, and swung my legs off the metal-framed cot. The floor was gritty and cold beneath my bare feet. I stumbled to the door, a solid slab of steel with a small wire-meshed window at eye level. My hand trembled as I wrapped it around the thick, cold handle and pulled. It resisted, then swung open with a deep, groaning screech of metal on metal. I leaned out, peering into the hallway, and my stomach tried to crawl up my throat. It was a war zone. The corridor was lit by the same sick, yellow light, flickering erratically. A medical cart lay on its side, its contents spilled across the grimy floor in a tide of filth. Syringes, dozens of them, were scattered like fallen thorns, their needles bent and dark with old blood. But that wasn't the worst of it. Lying in a sticky, black pool next to the cart were fingers. 3 of them, severed cleanly at the knuckle, looking like discarded doll parts. Pua. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. I staggered back into my room, slamming the heavy door shut with a deafening boom. My back hit the steel, and my hand slid down, brushing against a sheet of paper tacked to the wood. I turned and stared. It was an old, laminated sign, yellowed with age and stained with God knows what. The title was printed in stark, blood-red letters, Whiting Psychiatric Hospital. Below it, a heading read, Rules for Your Continued Existence. My eyes scanned the list, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. It didn't use numbers, just grim, blocky paragraphs. Your door must remain closed and locked at all times. No exceptions. They are drawn to the open and the vulnerable. My mind reeled as I read the next. Do not make eye contact with the faceless staff. Their attention is a curse you will not survive. It went on, each rule more insane than the last. Something about the water being unsafe, about making offerings of wrong meat to a keeper on the stairs, about running if you hear your name whispered from an empty room. The world tilted on its axis. This was a madhouse, a real one. But as the full weight of the sinister list settled upon me, one thought screamed louder than all the others. The first rule. The most important rule. A rule I had just broken. Bokeh, I had left my door wide open. I stood there, back pressed hard against the cold steel of the door, my own ragged breathing the only sound in the concrete box. My mind, a frantic mess of terror and confusion, replayed the words I had just read on that stained yellowed sign. Ma. The first rule. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a commandment written in the stark language of survival. Your door must remain closed and locked at all times. And the reason followed like a death sentence. They are drawn to the open and the vulnerable. Shush. I had left it wide open. For how long? A minute? 2? Long enough. A sudden, profound chill swept through the room, cutting through the stale air like a shard of ice. It was a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with presence. The single bare bulb overhead flickered once, twice, then buzzed with a renewed, sickly intensity. I felt it before I saw it, the weight of a gaze from the peephole. I was being watched. With a low, agonizing groan of rusted metal, the heavy door began to swing inward. I hadn't unlocked it. I hadn't touched the handle. It was opening on its own, inch by agonizing inch, revealing the horrific tableau of the hallway beyond. And then she stepped through the opening. She might have been a woman once. Now she was a mockery of life. Her skin was the pale, waxy gray of a corpse left too long in water, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Festering, open sores wept a thin, dark fluid down her arms and face. Long, stringy black hair, matted with blood and grime, hung over her features, but I could see enough. Her eyes were milky white, completely devoid of pupils, yet they were locked directly on me. Her jaw hung slightly slack, and a low, guttural hiss escaped her cracked lips. She took a lurching step into my room, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. The smell hit me then, the cloying sweetness of rot and decay, so thick I could taste it. Leo. The name was a rasp, a dry rattle from a throat that shouldn't have been able to make a sound. It was my name, but it sounded alien, profane, coming from her. Hearing it spoken by this thing was a violation that scraped at the deepest parts of my soul. My paralysis broke. I scrambled backward, tripping over my own feet and crashing to the floor. She was faster than she looked. In a blur of lurching motion, she was on top of me, her surprising weight pinning me to the concrete. Icy, bone-thin fingers clamped around my throat. The strength in her grip was impossible, a supernatural force that defied her emaciated frame. My air was cut off instantly. Black spots danced in my vision. Her face was inches from mine, the stench of the grave filling my lungs. The hissing sound grew louder, more insistent. Leo, Leo. Just as the world began to fade into a muffled black tunnel, a new figure filled the doorway. He was huge, a mountain of a man who had to duck to get through the frame. His hair was a wild, greasy mop, and his eyes were starkly, unsettlingly crossed, giving him a look of permanent, bewildered fury. He didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that belied his massive size. In his hand was a buck knife, its blade catching a grim glint from the overhead light. With a guttural roar, he lunged. There was a wet, percussive thud as the knife plunged into the side of the creature's head. It didn't scream. It let out a high-pitched, electronic-sounding shriek like a dying speaker, and its grip on my throat went slack. He yanked the knife free and stabbed again and again, a brutal, efficient flurry of violence. The thing convulsed and then collapsed sideways onto the floor, finally, blessedly still. Tre tu alpha. I lay there, gasping, dragging raw, painful air into my starving lungs. My savior stood over me, his broad chest heaving. He looked down at the corpse, then at me, his crossed eyes making it hard to tell exactly where he was looking. "You're new," he grunted, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And you're an idiot." He gestured with his bloody knife toward the sign on the door. "You read the rules, didn't you? That's number 1 for a reason." He reached down, grabbed the front of my thin hospital gown with one massive hand, and hauled me to my feet as if I weighed nothing. "Come on," he ordered, his voice urgent. "The noise will bring others. We need to hide." He dragged me out of the room, past the dead thing on the floor, and shoved me into the darkness of a nearby janitor's closet, pulling the door shut behind us. The heavy closet door clicked shut, plunging us into an almost absolute darkness. The only light was a thin, dirty line under the door. The space was suffocatingly small, smelling sharply of bleach, mildew, and the faint, coppery scent of old blood. My back was pressed against shelves of cleaning supplies, and the massive form of my savior was a wall of shadow in front of me. His heavy breathing filled the silence, a counterpoint to the frantic, panicked drumming of my own heart. The phantom pain of fingers around my throat still lingered. "You can breathe," the man's gravelly voice rumbled, startling me. "For now. They're not smart, but they can hear. We need to be quiet for a bit." I swallowed hard, the muscles in my throat raw and aching. "Thank you," I croaked, the words barely a whisper. You saved me." He made a grunting sound that wasn't exactly dismissive but held no room for gratitude. "Don't thank me. Just don't be an idiot again. I'm Silas." "Leo," I managed. My mind was a whirlwind of questions, but one spun at the center of the vortex. "That thing, what was it?" "A patient," Silas said, his tone flat and grim. "Or what's left of one. They die, but they don't stay dead. They just get hungry. You left your door open. It's like ringing a dinner bell." He shifted his weight, and I could feel the air move in the tiny space. "That sign on your door isn't a joke, Leo. It's not a prank from some orderly. It's a goddamn Bible. Every single rule is written in blood. The only reason I'm still breathing is because I follow them, every single one." His certainty was terrifying. This wasn't a delusion we shared. It was a reality he navigated. "How do you know? How did you end up in this hell?" There was a long silence. I thought maybe I'd pushed too far, but then he let out a long, weary sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Because I was crazy long before I got here," he said softly. "The regular kind of crazy." He paused. "They said I was criminally insane. Found me covered in blood, sitting between my girlfriend and the guy she was sleeping with. They weren't in one piece." I felt a fresh wave of fear, a different kind now. I was trapped in a closet with a murderer. As if sensing my terror, he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "I don't remember most of it. I had a psychotic break. For months I'd been hearing voices. They told me she was tainted, that she had a sickness inside her. They told me the only way to heal myself, to make the sickness go away, was to drink her blood." His voice cracked on the last few words, the first hint of emotion I'd heard from him. So I did what they told me. I could only stare at his hulking silhouette in the darkness, speechless. They locked me up, of course. Padded rooms, Thorazine, the works. I was supposed to rot in a state facility for the rest of my life. But then, one day, a man came to see me. He wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. He wore a pristine black suit that didn't have a single wrinkle, and his eyes were like empty holes. He sat across from me and told me they were transferring me. He leaned in close, and I'll never forget what he said. His voice was like stones grinding together. "Silas," he said, "the place you're going is different. The things you see, the voices you hear, they're not just in your head anymore. In Whiting, they're real." A chill that had nothing to do with the concrete walls ran down my spine. The shadow people. The screaming. My mother's voice. They had become real enough to inflict sickness on my body. This man in the black suit, he knew. He told me to find the rules and follow them if I wanted to live, Silas finished. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a room just like yours. That was 6 months ago. My fear of Silas the murderer evaporated, replaced by a strange, desperate kinship. His past didn't matter. His crime, born of madness, was from another world. In here, that madness made him a prophet. He wasn't just a killer. He was a survivor who had been given a warning. We were both prisoners in a place where the monsters from our minds had been given flesh and teeth. So we're here to be fed to them, I whispered, the horrible truth solidifying. Looks that way, Silas grunted. He shifted again, this time with purpose. But I'm not on the menu. I'm getting out. The question is, are you going to lie down and let them eat you, or are you going to get out with me? There was no choice to make. I'm with you, I said, my voice shaking, but with a sliver of newfound resolve. Good, he said. Then stop shaking and listen. To get out, we have to go down. And to go down, we have to get past the keeper of the stairs. Silas cracked the closet door, peering into the dim, bloody hallway. The silence that had been our shield now felt thin and fragile, ready to be torn apart by another shriek. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he grunted, satisfied. Clear, for now. He pushed the door open and stepped out. I followed, my legs still shaking, every nerve screaming at me to run back into the dark. The corpse of the thing he'd killed lay crumpled on the floor, a grotesque heap of gray flesh and matted hair. I tried to look away, but Silas walked right up to it. What are you doing? I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He knelt, grabbing the creature's limp arm. With a grim, workman-like efficiency, he took out his buckknife. Rule number 4, he said, more to himself than to me. Offerings must be made to the keeper of the stairs. Only wrong meat is accepted. My blood ran cold as I understood. Wrong meat, not food from the cafeteria, not something you could find, something you had to take. I watched in frozen horror as Silas sawed through the wrist. The sound was wet and thick, a gruesome combination of tearing sinew and grating bone. He worked quickly, his face a mask of stony concentration. With a final, sharp twist, the hand came free. He wiped the knife on the dead creature's gown, grabbed the severed hand by a finger, and stood up. It dangled from his grip, a pale, 5-fingered pendulum of horror. This should do it, he said, tucking the grisly offering into a deep pocket of his pants. He glanced at my face, which must have been a mask of pure revulsion. Get used to it, Leo. This place has a different currency. Now, come on. He led the way, his massive frame a comforting and terrifying sight. I followed close behind, stepping carefully around the pools of blood and the scattered, lonely fingers. We reached a heavy steel door at the far end of the hall. Stairwell B was stenciled on it in faded black paint. Silas put a hand on the door, then paused, looking back at me. His crossed eyes seemed to lock onto mine. Don't make a sound, he breathed. Don't move unless I do, and no matter what you see, do not scream. Understand? I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. He pushed the door open, and we stepped through. We were immediately hit by a wall of damp, cold air that smelled of wet concrete, mold, and something else, something coppery and reptilian. The stairwell was a narrow, concrete chasm descending into an oppressive darkness. A single flickering bulb, identical to the one in my room, cast long, dancing shadows down the steps. We had taken no more than 3 steps onto the first landing when Silas froze, holding out an arm to stop me. A sound echoed up from the darkness below, a soft, rhythmic clicking and chittering, like 1,000 giant insects stirring in their nest. It grew louder, closer. A scraping sound like claws on stone accompanied it. Then, a shape began to emerge from the gloom of the lower flight of stairs. It was huge, unfolding itself into the weak light. It had to be 8 feet tall, its body a segmented, blood-red exoskeleton that glistened wetly in the dim light. It had no eyes, no face, just a smooth, chitinous head. As it raised itself to its full, horrifying height, its jaw unhinged, splitting its head vertically in a way that defied all laws of biology, revealing a maw filled not with fangs, but with long, thin teeth that looked like shards of black serrated sword blades. The keeper. I was paralyzed, every muscle locked, every instinct screaming. This was a nightmare given form, a creature born from the deepest, most primal fears of humanity. It took a step up onto our landing, the concrete groaning under its weight. The chittering was deafening now, vibrating through the soles of my feet. Silas, however, was calm. He moved with a slow, deliberate motion, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the severed hand. He held it up, displaying it for the blind creature. The keeper stopped, its featureless head tilting as if it could sense the offering. It opened its impossible mouth again, letting out a low, guttural hiss. With a flick of his wrist, Silas tossed the hand. It landed on the steps a few feet in front of the monster with a wet, soft slap. The keeper lowered its head, its jaw closing over the offering with a sickening wet crunch of bone and flesh. It was distracted, completely absorbed in its gruesome meal. "Now," Silas hissed, grabbing my arm. He pulled me forward, pressing us flat against the cold, grimy wall. We skirted the edge of the landing, slipping past the monster's enormous bulk. I could feel a dry, fetid heat radiating from its crimson shell. I could hear the wet, cracking sounds of it devouring the hand. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. One wrong move, one sound, and that jaw would be closing on me. Dacha. We made it to the top of the next flight of stairs and scrambled down, not stopping until we reached the landing below and the door to the first floor. Only then did we risk a look back up. The keeper was still there, a crimson silhouette, finishing its payment. We had passed the test. We had paid the toll. The door to the first floor swung open into what had once been a cafeteria. Now, it was a scene of utter ruin. Tables were overturned, chairs were smashed into kindling, and a thick layer of dust and grime coated every surface. The air was heavy with the smell of stale food and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet that I was beginning to associate with death in this place. The only light came from large, barred windows that looked out onto an overgrown, neglected courtyard, the gray afternoon light filtering weakly through the dirt-caked glass. A low moan drew our attention to the far corner of the room. Huddled against the wall, half hidden behind a fallen vending machine, was a woman. She was emaciated, her skin a pallid, almost translucent white, her hospital gown torn and stained with blood. A dark, ugly wound blossomed on her abdomen, and her breaths were shallow, rattling things. Silas and I rushed to her side. Her eyes, wide and glassy with pain, flickered between us. You're trying to get out," she rasped, a faint trickle of blood appearing at the corner of her mouth. "We are," Silas said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. He knelt beside her, a look of grim pity on his face. "Do you know how?" She coughed, a wet, rattling sound that shook her entire body. "The key," she whispered, her gaze drifting toward a door at the other end of the cafeteria marked key room in faded letters. "The front door key. It's in there. Always is." Her eyes refocused on us, a spark of desperate urgency in them. "But you have to be careful. You have to beware of the guard." "The guard?" I asked, kneeling beside Silas. "What guard?" But her eyes had already lost their focus. Her head lolled to the side, and the last, faint breath rattled from her lips. She was gone. Silas stared at her for a long moment, then rose to his feet. "She helped us. The least we can do is get out." He looked around the ruined cafeteria. "We need to eat something. We don't know what's next." Our meal was as pathetic as our surroundings. We found a few sealed, single-serving packets of peanut butter in a tipped-over supply cart. It was stale and oily, but it was sustenance. We ate in grim silence, the dead woman's warning hanging in the air between us. Beware the guard. The name itself was ominous. Another piece of this hospital's twisted mythology, another rule unwritten on the sign. With the meager meal finished, we made our way to the key room. The door was unlocked. Silas pushed it open slowly, his buck knife held ready at his side. The room was small and cramped, little more than a closet. One wall was covered with a large pegboard, hundreds of hooks hammered into it. Most of the hooks were empty, but on a few, keys still dangled, glinting faintly. "It has to be one of these," I whispered, stepping inside. "The big one, for the front door." As I moved toward the board, a shape detached itself from the deep shadows in the corner of the room. It was tall and unnervingly thin, clad in the crisp, dark uniform of a watchman, complete with a flat-topped cap pulled low. But it had no face. Where its features should have been, there was only a smooth, blank expanse of pale skin. This was the guard. Before either of us could react, it raised its hands. They were huge, disproportionately large for its slender frame, and embedded in the center of each palm, staring out at us, was a single, massive, bloodshot eyeball. The eyes swiveled in their fleshy sockets, wetly blinking, and fixed on us. A wave of pure, psychic dread washed over me, a silent scream that originated from the creature itself. It was a feeling of being seen, not just with eyes, but in a way that stripped you down to your soul, to your most primal fears. The guard lunged. It didn't make a sound, moving with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly terrifying. It swiped at Silas, who dodged back, bringing his knife up in a defensive arc. The creature was impossibly fast. It backhanded him not with its knuckles, but with the flat of its palm, as if trying to press its awful, seeing eye against him. The blow sent Silas stumbling back into the hallway. The guard turned its faceless head toward me. One of its giant, eye-filled hands shot out, grabbing my shoulder. The touch was cold, and the eye in its palm stared into me, flooding my mind with images of failure and despair. The look on my mother's face, the shadow people, the helplessness of my catatonia. Suddenly, Silas roared. He charged back into the room, a force of pure, desperate rage. He ignored the paralyzing fear and drove his knife into the creature's side. The guard emitted a high-pitched, vibrating hum, a sound of pain that I felt in my teeth. It released me, turning its full attention to Silas. They grappled, a frantic dance of death in the tiny room. Silas was a berserker, stabbing and slashing with wild abandon. The guard fought silently, its seeing hands swiping and grabbing, trying to land a final soul-crushing touch. With a final, desperate heave, Silas shoved the creature back against the pegboard and drove his knife up under its jaw, plunging the blade deep into its faceless head. The vibrating hum stopped. The eyes in its palms rolled back, and the creature slid down the wall, leaving a dark smear on the board, keys clattering to the floor around it. Silas stood over it, panting, covered in its strange, thin blood. "Leo," he gasped. "The key! Grab the key!" My eyes frantically scanned the floor. There, gleaming amongst the others, was a large, ornate, old-fashioned iron key. The front door key. I snatched it up, its cold, heavy weight, a symbol of hope in my trembling hand. "I've got it! Let's go!" We didn't wait for another monster to appear, we ran. Silas, despite his exhaustion and the dark blood seeping through his uniform, set a punishing pace down the main hall. I clutched the heavy iron key in my hand. Its cold weight, the only thing that felt real in the waking nightmare. The hallway was long and cavernously empty, our frantic footsteps echoing off the peeling walls. And then we saw it. At the far end of the hall, bathed in the muted gray light from a transom window above, was the front door. It was even more imposing than I had imagined. A massive slab of steel set into a reinforced concrete frame, covered in rivets and secured with a lock the size of my fist. It wasn't a door, it was a vault hatch, designed to keep the horrors in, not people out. We slowed as we approached, panting, chests heaving. Silas leaned against the wall for support, his bloody knife still clutched in his hand. "Go on," he gasped, nodding toward the lock. "Do it!" My hands were shaking so violently I could barely guide the key. The metal felt slick with my sweat. I shoved it into the keyhole. It scraped, resisted. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought it was the wrong one, that our fight had been for nothing. I jammed it harder, twisting with all my might. There was a loud, grating groan from the lock's ancient mechanism, and then a heavy, deeply satisfying clunk that echoed through the hall. It was unlocked. Hope, pure and electrifying, surged through me. Silas and I shared a look, a fleeting, desperate acknowledgement of what we had survived. Together, we threw our shoulders against the massive door. It protested with a scream of rusted hinges, then swung open. Hito! We burst out into the world. The sensation was overwhelming. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. The sunlight, even filtered through an overcast sky, was blindingly bright after the perpetual gloom of Whiting. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the first clean breath I'd had in what felt like a lifetime. We were standing on crumbling stone steps that led down to a wildly overgrown lawn. We were outside. We were free. A triumphant, choked laugh escaped my lips. We did it. We actually. A sound from behind us cut my relief short. A sound I had prayed I would never hear again. Den Prien. The soft, rhythmic clicking and chittering of claws on stone. I turned slowly, my blood turning to ice. The keeper was standing in the open doorway, its towering, 8-foot frame eclipsing the light from the hall. Its blood-red exoskeleton seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and its faceless head was tilted in our direction. It had followed us. It had somehow known. The rules of the stairs didn't apply to the front door. We stared, frozen for a second in pure, unadulterated terror. Then Silas grabbed me, shoving me forward. "Run, Leo! Run!" We scrambled down the steps and tore across the overgrown lawn, branches and thorns whipping at our legs. But I knew it was hopeless. I could hear the monster's heavy, thudding steps behind us, gaining ground with impossible speed. It was a predator built for the hunt. We would never outrun it. Silas must have known it too. About 50 yards from the building, he skidded to a stop. "Leo, don't stop running!" he yelled, his voice a raw command. "Silas, no!" I cried, turning back. He faced the charging creature, a grim, final acceptance in his stance. He was a mountain of a man against a creature from hell, a tiny buckknife, his only weapon. It was suicide. It was a sacrifice. "Someone has to tell them what this place is," he roared, his crossed eyes fixed on the approaching horror. "Don't let it be for nothing! Go!" He then let out a defiant battle cry and charged forward, a final, heroic act of insanity. Nice, tears streamed down my face, but I did what he said. I turned and ran. I ran with the sound of Silas's roar turning into a choked scream of agony. I ran as I heard the sickening, wet crunch of the keeper's jaw closing. I ran until the sounds faded behind me, until my lungs were on fire and my legs were numb. I clutched the iron key in my fist and just kept running, leaving the hospital from hell and its final victim behind me. I eventually stumbled out of the woods and onto a highway, a wild-eyed man in a tattered hospital gown. A trucker picked me up, his face a mixture of pity and fear. I tried to tell him, I tried to tell the police, I tried to tell the doctors at the next hospital they sent me to. No one believed me. They said Whiting Psychiatric Hospital had been abandoned for 50 years, a condemned ruin. They said my story was a vivid delusion, a product of the trauma and paranoid schizophrenia they were so quick to diagnose. But they can't explain the key I still hold in my hand. They can't explain the scars on my throat, or the crippling knowledge of what I survived. I am free, but I am not. I carry the weight of Silas's sacrifice and the truth of that place. They say I'm crazy, but I know better. The monsters are real, and I have the key that proves it. And one day, I will make them believe me.